All right. Hello, Catholic YouTube. Brian with City of the Immaculata back with you. I am joined today by my friend Erik Bootsma. Super excited today to have him on the channel. Erik has had a passion for building nearly his whole life, growing up the child of a contractor and a painter. Architecture was an especially apt vocation. Working for his father's construction firm for his teenage and college years, he built up valuable experience in the field of architecture, learning intimately how building really works. Later, being trained in the classical liberal arts at Thomas Aquinas College's Great Books program, he became interested in the philosophy of architecture and aesthetics. This philosophy was the foundation upon which he completed his architectural education with a Master's of Architecture degree from the University of Notre Dame. Erik, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
So I figured I would start today off with just a question about maybe an introduction for people that aren't aware. It seems like in the Catholic Church, there are certain rules and guidelines as far as architecture goes. And I'm wondering why that's important, Erik, and why we just can't build, why we maybe shouldn't build, maybe the correct way to ask, to the latest aesthetic trends. And maybe related to that, is there a certain telos in architecture?
Yeah, well, the first thing is that as far as building standards go in the Catholic Church, the Church does say a number of things about how it builds, but it says not very much exactly about particulars. The canon law, the older canon law from 1917, had a few more particulars about altars and how they were to be constructed. Canon law still says certain things about tabernacles, etc. But what it does say, what the church does teach about church architecture, is that it's a deeply symbolic thing. The church teaches that a church building is, and this is in the rite of dedication, is a sign and symbol of heavenly realities. And I think that's probably the most powerful thing that the church teaches about a church building, that it's there to be symbolic of these heavenly realities. And I always say this is my phrase is that art cannot not symbolize. So that when you have a work of art, work of architecture, when you have it absent of symbols and absent of certain things, that the shape of the building, the configuration of the building, the configuration of the church symbolizes things. It tells you exactly what's going on philosophically there. So a church, what I always talk about is that it's a sign and symbol of these heavenly realities. And the heavenly realities is something that Dennis McNamara teaches in his excellent book on the spirit of the liturgy. It's a symbol of the New Jerusalem. And that symbol is carried through by the tradition of church architecture, which goes all the way back to the temple and the tabernacle in the desert. So the tabernacle and the temple has a very simple plan to it. It has a courtyard that surrounds the tabernacle, and then the tabernacle itself is composed of two major parts: the holy place, which is kind of long and rectangular, and then the Holy of Holies, which is where in there was where the Ark of the Covenant was, with the Ten Commandments. But this was the place where God made Himself actually present. This gets carried forward in the temple, where it gets enlarged and it gets built into stone rather than as a tent. But it keeps that same shape. It's this oblong area in front, and then the Holy of Holies is actually the shape of a cube. Then that tradition gets carried forward into the synagogue, and instead of having the Ten Commandments and the Ark of the Covenant there, the scrolls of the Torah are kept there. It's called the Bema, and that tradition then gets transformed into a church. And in the church, this is the nave and the sanctuary. And what that does is it connects those two into the past. And then if we look at Revelation, we can see how the New Jerusalem is described. It's described as a city of gold, which is in the shape of a cube. And that harkens back directly to the temple. It's a cube made of gold, where in the center of this, God is there. God is present. In the New Jerusalem, God is present there. So in between these two extremes of the temple and tabernacle on one end and the New Jerusalem on the other, we have the church. And when we build a church, we're in that line between those two. And so the symbols that we're carrying, we're both looking back to the temple, but also looking forward to the New Jerusalem. So that we can say we have the nave corresponding to the holy place and the Holy of Holies and the sanctuary. But in there, in all three of these places, we have God really present in this place. And the configuration and the overall sort of shape of this thing carries forward that symbol. So anything that's symbolized, it has sort of idioms and things like that allow you to sort of say, well, that's what that symbolizes. So having that shape of the nave and the sanctuary, that very simple thing, that alone connotes a lot about what the church is teaching. It says, this is where God is. And so since the 1950s, and even before that, church architecture has taken on the idea that the church should be shaped like a fan, or should be shaped like a theater. The tabernacle or the altar should be in the center of it. It should be more focused on the people. But what that does is it diminishes the symbolism that the church has of time between the temple and the New Jerusalem, and it also diminishes that symbolism of God is actually present here, right? So it's no doubt in my mind that it may not be the contributing factor, but it's a contributing factor of people not believing in true presence anymore. So I think that's something that needs to be understood, that the church teaches about these symbols, but it has a very clear teaching and understanding through Scripture of what a church is. We just have to kind of unpack these things, and it's not in anything that's been said in documents and canon law, these sorts of things, but it's something that's there to be unpacked and to be understood.
It reminds me of what I believe it may have came from Augustine, or at least maybe Augustine's time, where even just speaking of the liturgy itself, when you're speaking about how the architecture, as a sign, uh, the lex orandi, lex credendi, right? The liturgy itself is a sign, and it says how we pray says much about what we're saying is taking place inside of this building. It's kind of what brought to my mind there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I would imagine, as you were saying, with the canon law and the both the restrictions and the allowances there, it seems like there would certainly be then some leeway, since we do see down through the centuries different styles of Catholic architecture. And I guess at a foundational level, is it your opinion there then that it's this it's the tabernacle, it's the central part of the structure itself that unites all of these sometimes disparate elements? Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's that symbol. It allows you to be. I think that very basic configuration of the sanctuary and the nave is the real essence of what makes a church a church. And then, like I said, there's any number of different ways of expressing that. There's Gothic, there's classical, there's Romanesque, all of these things. I don't tend to think any of these are particularly correct. Um, uh, Correct across the board, but I think they can be very correct for certain situations. And I think they are particularly tied to, say, for instance, for culture.
Mhm.
Someone comes from a French background, your community is mostly French or something like that. There's a certain sort of a cultural symbolism that's carried forward that when you use certain forms of architecture, they understand this is a church. This is a place which we that carries forward all of the sort of things that we understand in our sort of cultural background and sorts of things. So, for instance, things like we wear black when there's a funeral, we wear white for a wedding, that sort of thing. Those are cultural things which we all sort of we come to understand over time. And then architecture does the same sort of thing. It carries these idioms and it carries symbolism with it. So using um, yeah, any of these symbols within that sort of cultural background can be good. It can, however, these things change too, and I think that's the other thing too is that styles and cultures and things like that sort of change. I was reminded a story about a church in Chicago. Chicago being very famously a very Polish city, most of the churches there built by the Poles, and so they had these they're just absolutely wonderful sort of baroque things were all built by Polish workers, and they would always bring the things which were important to them. So like Our Lady of Czestochowa is like a symbol which is really you find every Polish church there's an image of it there. And over time the neighborhood had ceased to be Polish and became Hispanic. I think it was Mexican mostly. And the pastor, thinking he was going to be very culturally appropriate and everything, he took down Czestochowa and he put up Guadalupe, which is wonderful. But the little old ladies, these little old Mexican ladies, says, "Well, you took down our Mary."
Mm.
They said, "Well." He said, "Well, don't you want Guadalupe?" No, 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 but we love this one now. So these sorts of things, sort of, they change over time, and I think that's one thing. The glorious thing about culture is it allows there's a melding of things and changing of things over time. And so and Guadalupe is one of those things too, which was primarily Hispanic dedication. And my wife and I actually were very lucky to go to Mexico City a couple of weeks ago and got to see the Guadalupe Shrine. And it's glorious. And I think, and now it's having sort of a more sort of general um, uh, dedication to Guadalupe outside of the Hispanic community in the United States. And that influence is probably a good and a positive thing too.
Yeah, it seems like some of these, I would like to get maybe towards the end here, some of the contrivances that took place maybe post 1950s, but maybe before we get there,
Yeah.
if a person, I want to use that in the broadest sense of the word, traditionally speaking, before let's say before 20th century or whatever, if a person were to walk into a Catholic church, visitor walks in, and a more traditionally oriented parish, what would he or she be likely? What would they kind of expect to find in these parishes?
Yeah.
Europe, I guess, would be the prime place to look towards, but just in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think you would walk into a church, you would find the narthex beginning, sort of the area at the beginning of the church, and I think usually that would be the place where the baptismal font was. And again, this goes back to ancient tradition of the baptismal font was the place where you entered into the church, but it also harkens back to the temple. It was a place of ablutions, a place of cleansing, ceremonial cleansing, coming into the temple area. So that was there, and then you would walk in and find the nave, and the nave being that very long and narrow space, but all oriented towards the altar and the tabernacle on it. And then, of course, the sanctuary will be a raised space and a place for that to be there. But but again, I think what you kind of alluded to about these changes in the 1950s and 60s, that I think it was a lot of church leaders thought that this was this was the old way of doing things. It also kind of came with it the idea of older architecture and traditional architecture with it. But in the 1940s and 50s, modernist architecture and really radical architecture became very popular in the general culture. And so I think a lot of church leaders thought, if we don't adapt to this, we're going to get lost and we're going to seem like we're stuck in the past and we're going to lose people. And so they adopted a lot of these things and brought them into the church. I mean, a lot of it came with a lot of radical ideas about the liturgy as well. I mean, if you read some of the folks who wrote about liturgy in the 50s and 60s leading up to Vatican II, the liturgical conference out of Minnesota, particularly, they wanted to emphasize that the tabernacle and the Eucharist were not to be emphasized, but it was to be the people, and so it was moving everything out so that everyone could gather and be there together as one people. I think it was and then together with the changes in architecture, which stripped out symbolism. I talked to again, I talk about sort of symbolism and culture and the multiculturalism in the best way possible is the Catholic Church, because it brings in all of the cultures. Every knee shall bend, right? I'm reminded of the modernist architect of the cathedral in Oakland, who said, we have 17 different cultures who are here, from all over the world, and so what we need to do is remove all of the cultural icons and the cultural references and come down to basically down to the lowest common denominator, which is no symbols whatsoever. And I always sort of thought that was the backwards way of doing it, going back to those the little old ladies in Chicago that they're happy to bring these things together and happy to bring them together. And I think culture is one of those things that like I said, it changes and it melds and it adds things to it and it makes things better. It's not it's like a St. Thomas would always say, it's yes and it's this and this. It's not that or that. So I think having the idea of like I said, for culture, it's like the Tex-Mex music is a great example of it. It's like it's German music that came to Texas via the Swiss and the Germans and the Czechs who all came there, and then the Mexicans adopted it and made it their own, and it's something completely different from anything. Food too, things like that. We add these things together and change them, but it's a yes and it's not a reducing of things. And I think the Catholic Church has always been very good about increasing rather than reducing opportunities for symbolism and understanding and depth and devotions and things like that. So I think that was a move that was brought on through sort of the liturgical movement before Vatican II and whatnot that said we need to reduce things. We think we need to eliminate things down so that we're sort of focusing on the right things. But it can be a yes and yes, we can have devotional spaces. Yes, we can have devotional art, and yes, we can have. And then I think sometimes too, I think those are the things which actually help focus on things like the Mass and the Eucharist itself, and that the active part of the Mass can be really emphasized and given a lot more depth when all these other things are around it. And I think it was a profound mistake to think that people are unable to understand the Mass if they're being quote unquote distracted by other things.
Yeah, and I've spent quite a bit of time. I actually recently wrote a book. It's not published as of the recording of this video, but it's on the subject of enculturation. And one of the things that I found, while studying this is somewhere, maybe due to some of the actually justifiably bad things that certain European governments did around the world, the Catholic Church kind of I don't individuals within the Catholic Church is probably the more appropriate way to say this. At times, try to like step in and come up with these contrived enculturation projects that at times were contra to what the cultures that they were attempting to appeal to would have appealed to them. Like, for example, with if you take the Catholic Church in India, there's a general feeling that you can find in certain art that like, for example, it's okay to represent the Madonna and Child in a way that is culturally appropriate to a certain people. But in India, there's a representation of Our Lady, and she's very European in her complexion. But it's a very popular devotion in India. And my attitude on that is like, why try to force something on an Indian culture if they're otherwise accepting this? Because if you look at Indian art traditionally, anyways, their representation of their previous deities, they didn't exactly represent your average Indian on this. A lot of them were blue and purple in
Yeah,
complexions,
yeah,
right? So
yeah,
obviously, it's not like the most important thing in the world. And I feel like that's sort of like they're trying to micromanage. And I'm not, just to loosely make a comparison, if you see the way that, like, say, Marxists, for example, failed in controlling the way the economy was going to go, right? You can see how sort of the
yeah,
disastrous results of that goes. I feel like when you try to top down culture,
yeah,
you end up making kind of the sort of silly mistakes that I feel like we're still, at least the fumes, we're still going through in some respects. Um, and some of the things that you will see happening in some of these parishes, and particularly, I mean, my most of my knowledge is what's happened in the United States, but
yeah,
uh,
yeah. I think there's a tendency to think that again, it's that idea of that striving for cultural relevance
mhm,
that so many people, leadership in the church, try to create, from the sort of top down, instead of just allowing sort of it coming up from the bottom and the individual parish level and these things. The where culture and where things, individual pieces of art and places of pilgrimage, they happen. They pop up. They sometimes they come out of nowhere. Like thinking about, I go out to Kansas a lot, and there's I'm blanking on the name of the nun who was there, but there's a huge devotion to her now. Who, she was very holy, and it just kind of came out of nowhere. And she's in Missouri, western part of Missouri, and it's become this place of pilgrimage. It's become this place where who knew about this place 50 years ago? Nothing. That couldn't be imposed by by the top down. And but again, the sort of cultural relevance thing too. I look at the art and the graphic design that comes out of the Vatican sometimes, and I kind of just shake my head at it, because they're trying so desperately to appeal to people to look at sort of popular ways of doing things, and it's a failure for the most part. It looks contrived, and it looks childish, and it looks um, again, like being pandered to. I think there's a room, and particularly what I think about in my art and my architecture is that I'm trying to be mature about these things and try to be listen to appeal to things which are longer lasting and have deeper roots than anything else. Trying to just sort of change everything you do to fit what's going on right now. You can be relevant now, but in 10 years you'll be completely irrelevant. But the things which are enduring, you look at Notre Dame in Paris, that continues, 500-600 years after being built, hundreds of years after it's being built, it continues to have tremendous importance for people. Even people like in France who aren't Catholic, it's important to them, which we hope that because of that importance helps remind them of where it came from. So,
France, our wayward daughter, right? The
mhm.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about like Notre Dame, for example, like I have no particular ties to, I'm no French family. I have no real ties to the French, but it felt like a personal um, devastation for my own
Yeah,
family when we saw the roof of the cathedral in flames. It was like a hit in my gut. And I can't say that would be the same for me for um, other places around the world. So yeah, I absolutely agree with that. One thing I think is, we've kind of walked up to the doorstep of it, and I think maybe uh, if you haven't answered it, I know it's a question many of my audience would be interested in knowing the answer to, because we've kind of alluded to the 40s and 50s into the 60s. But if there is a trajectory there, or if you just really find its roots maybe in that liturgical movement, for example, the question that I have is really like, what in the world happened in the 70s and 80s? Because I've never exactly gotten a clear answer. And it does seem like, okay, yeah, there was like a seeds for it, especially by the 60s. But there's also, I mean, you do have certain guardrails that seem to have been in place even up to the constitutions of Vatican II, and then some of the encyclicals that came out from the Vatican after that. Was it just like the floodgates, a crack in the dam? I mean, what happened in the 70s?
Well, I think you could say it's like a crack in the dam, because I think the roots of it all, it didn't start at Vatican II, but Vatican II was the place where a lot of these things came to a head. I mean, it really has roots, in the late 19th century, and I'm not enough of a good historian of liturgy and whatnot to understand this, but at least by the time of Romano Guardini in the 1920s, the liturgical movement was really kind of focused on trying to get um, the liturgy to focus back on what was going on right there. They were trying to get an understanding of the liturgy as being not just. I'll probably make some Orthodox people very angry about this, but my understanding of Orthodox liturgy sometimes is the liturgy is sort of going on, and people kind of come and go, and they have their devotions and whatnot while the liturgy is going on there behind the iconostasis, and then there's moments where we sort of pay attention. So again, I'm not a scholar of Orthodox liturgy, but it was my understanding that like there was a time when the Catholic liturgy was much like that, and I think there was some genuine need to kind of focus it in on the liturgy. And I think there are moments in time when the liturgy, the focus on the liturgy was even going back to the Council of Trent, and focusing in on what was important there. I mean, the Council of Trent was where we got the Tridentine liturgy, and I always laugh about this. I call it liturgical dance. And I'm serious though that it's liturgical dance, the old Tridentine rite, because it's movement that's symbolic. It's movement symbolic order towards the right thing. It's not self-expression. That's kind of what we think about liturgical dance, but it's all oriented to it. And I always kind of think about that moment where like the priest the priest he's there saying the words of the institution, and then all of a sudden he raises up the host, and the bells go off, and everything starts going off in this moment, right? But in the Council of Trent, architecturally speaking, that was also all ordered towards that. Before the Council of Trent, there were iconostases in Western architecture. And there's a lot of people. Rood screens were common in England. You still see them in England now because they split off before Trent. Um, and the ones that are left over after the Protestants got to it. But anyway, so it all sort of goes back to like this idea of this focus. But what happened is they started getting sort of modern ideas about what the liturgy was for, and I think they lost a sense of devotion to it. And I think there was a movement in the 40s, 50s, and 60s to de-emphasize the Eucharist and de-emphasize the Eucharist as an object of devotion. And I think that was probably not wise. And I think the architecture corresponds to that, because the architecture, the tabernacle always gets put off to the side. The focus on fan-shaped seating, going to the altar, it's the action which is going on, not the devotion of the thing. So that is what kind of happened. That was all sort of bubbling up until Vatican II hit, and then when Vatican II hit, and there were certain changes that were made, not as many as most people would think. Most of the changes, and again, the documents themselves say only change that which is necessary. But I think in the age we live in an age now where we have all the information possible at our fingertips. So like we can look up what all the documents of Vatican II said, and we can read them ourselves. 1960s, I doubt, 1 in 100 parishioners in a parish had ever read a single thing that, had ever read Sacrosanctum Concilium. So when that's happening, the priests who wanted to have all these radical changes came and they said, well, Vatican II said to do it. Everybody said, okay. And in fact, I have one particular book. I have to find the reference exactly, but there was a liturgist who said, well, Vatican II didn't do everything we wanted it to do, but we're just going to go ahead and do it anyway. And they literally said, they just said we're going to do it. And so most of the things that happened in the 60s and 70s and 80s, changes were not mandated. They were not called for. In architecture, for sure, a lot of things were not called for. I have a standing bet. I would say I will pay someone $10,000 if they find something from the Vatican that says you need to remove the altar rails. It was never there, but it's always constantly. I've heard it hundreds of times almost from architects, from liturgists, from bishops even, who say we need to remove the altar rails because Vatican II. But it's not there. It's just not there. But there was a movement there that said we want everyone to be there. We want to focus on the people. We want the focus to be on the priest. We want the focus on the people as priests, as action in there. So you get things like, putting the priest in the place where the tabernacle used to be. So it was kind of a radical restructuring of things. And I think for the most part, it was not called for at all in Vatican II. But it was one of those moments where sort of there's this push for it, and they said, well, now we have a justification for it because we have this new radical document that lets us do all these things. When you actually read it, it's fairly conservative. And I think there's been even some. I remember reading a very good article on how the text references, the actual references in the document itself, and the references to other texts that it was referencing were all sort of stripped out of it systematically. So you didn't go back and look at what Pius XII said about liturgy or what the Council of Trent said about liturgy. It kind of let you see all of these things without any context whatsoever, or without any understanding of the history of many of these liturgical changes. So that, allowed it to be so you can just read this statement in and of itself. But if you don't have any reference back to other documents and other thoughts on that, you don't have any real, it's just sort of taken in the void, and you can interpret it in many different ways instead of in context of a larger tradition. So it kind of consciously got rid of traditions that were going on there. Although, when you do read all these things within a context of tradition, it makes a lot more, it leans more towards the traditional sense of things. And I think there's my sense too in the Vatican too, that it was sort of shocking to some that it would be taken as far as it did. I mean, there's a document called Opera Artis, and it is on the preservation of the artwork of the church, and it's essentially saying, stop doing this. And it was 1967 or 69. It comes out of the Vatican and it says, and I don't think it may be the divine worship, but not from the Pope. But the Pope probably saw this. But it's like, stop destroying artwork and churches that you're doing it radically. You need to stop doing it, and that kind of tells you how much of this sort of radical iconoclasm was going on at the time.
That's the word I was actually. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's iconoclasm. Yeah, it really is, and it's partially a religious one, but I think it's also partially just from the artistic culture as a whole, because you find just in architecture, in non-sacred architecture and just regular residential or every other building, they stripped everything from it. So they wanted to just strip everything out and whitewash everything, because that was the way to be pure. It goes back to the modernist architecture, which is, like you mentioned, it's Marxist. Most of the modernist architecture And, some of the radical, modernists don't like to say that, but when you actually read, when you read Corbusier, you read some of the early modernists, they really did believe that, this is a new industrial world, this is a new industrial way of doing things. We need to have sweep everything else aside and make mankind be industrial, which comes right out of Marx. So.
It reminds me, there's a really great, I haven't read it in, gosh, over a decade, but what's his name? Diarman McAuliffe, I think he wrote a book called The Reformation, and I'm super fascinated by the early period of the Reformation, because if you, when Luther releases his 95 Thesis, and the printing press picks it up, and that snowball gets to rolling, you see these like little sparks of what's about to happen. Where I think like in Zurich, for example, they start these like these fires in the equivalent of the 16th century parking lot of the churches, where they start pulling out almost immediately. They start pulling out all of the statues. Happens up in Danzig, and you get this real like almost like a spontaneous iconoclasm. Now it later, I think, definitely solidifies into a theological iconoclasm. Like, maybe I'm not as familiar with what happened around the events of earlier in Nicaea too, with the iconoclast movement there. But I know with the Reformation, it sort of starts as this like bubbling of a populist movement, and then it turns into this like justification after the fact. And I'd always wondered about that, with what happened in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, because, and you'll probably find this interesting, Eric, I don't know if I'd ever told you this before, but my mom owned a art restoration shop in the city there where you guys are for 30 years. And I remember back in I was a young boy at the time, but I used to spend time in her shop, and she kept getting these porcelain Mary statues, the ones that are like 3-4 foot tall, whatever. And my young boy mind, I kept seeing them, and I was like, Mom, why do we keep seeing these Mary statues in your shop? Like, what's the deal here? And the one that she had in the shop at that moment, somebody from a parish, I won't name names, I'm sure you would be aware of the parish though, had pulled this statue out of the dumpster. A parishioner, right? And it's like, and I'm glad that this person, I think back on that statue a lot, and hopefully with my mom's, with the preservation work that she did, that statue is got a place of prominence again somewhere. But it's a parishioner had the wherewithal to remove that statue from the dumpster, which is nice. But you have to wonder how many of those statues didn't get removed from dumpsters. But just the fact that that was like actually happening at that time,
Yeah, it was. Yeah, you don't have to say a parish, because all the parishes, everyone did,
Hmm.
everyone. And I have spoken with priests who were, educated in that time, and they've literally told me a crucifix on the wall behind the altar is a distraction from the mass. So that's what they really believed, and I just think it's completely false, because it helps focus back on what is going on. So yeah, no, that's the story of it, and thankfully, I think the tide has turned back the other direction. That most people will want to have beautiful art. We want to have color. We want to have beautiful liturgy, vestments, the whole thing, because it's all there. We believe to the glory of God, but also to kind of help focus us on what's important.
Well, that's
We
kind of
we
maybe
dress up the things which we dress up, and we decorate the things that are important to us. Just like when you and we do things that are frivolous and they're unnecessary, right? Like a birthday cake is unnecessary, but it's a celebration. It's there.
Well, that was going to be kind of maybe to wind the conversation down.
Yeah.
I wanted to get your sort of, because as somebody that has the finger on the pulse of kind of what's happening in the at least the architectural world, if you are optimistic, we'll say, maybe even if not optimistic, are you hopeful for where things are headed here in 2025?
Yeah, I really am. In the 15 or so years that I've been doing this now, no, take that back, almost 20 years now I've been doing this. The early 2000s could be depressing. The things which were still being, churches being renovated. That wasn't even like common. That was the norm. Now we're in sort of a stage of all of those sort of renovations that have happened since the 60s are being redone. I predominantly my work has been doing those sort of renovations to return altars back to the center, put in good art, put in paint and color into churches, and restoring things. So that's an encouraging sign to me and younger priests. And I'm now feeling old. Anyone who's I feel like if, I can consider younger priests, in their 50s, who are doing most of this stuff, and the ones who are even younger than them, they're even more enthusiastic about doing it. And I think that's just the norm now. So people want, new churches get built, they look more like a traditional church. I think the sort of experimental styles from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and even the 80s, they're not being built at the number that they used to be. Maybe there have been, I would say, in the last 10 or 15 years, there have been a number of cathedrals built. They're probably at this point even on the modernist versus traditional. Whereas, I would have thought, 20 years ago, like, building a traditional cathedral was impossible. But they've done it in Knoxville. They did it in Raleigh, and there's certainly more happening all over the place. Monasteries that are popping up of contemplative orders and working orders, the Benedictines, the Carmelites. They're building beautiful things everywhere. The Dominicans, of course, are doing it as well. And I think the colleges, which are very orthodox in their teachings, they're also embracing it too. So my alma mater, Thomas Aquinas, has built a beautiful chapel, and I work with Benedictine College, and they're building a new library there, which is traditional. It's not a liturgical space, but it's an embrace of beautiful things. Even Hillsdale College, which isn't Catholic, but nevertheless have built a multi-purpose church that Duncan Stroik, who's a Catholic architect, built as well. So it's an encouraging. I think we're in an encouraging moment. It's certainly trending in the right direction as far as architecture goes, as far as I'm concerned. I'm certainly getting busier and busier every year, and always looking for more work, but it always seems to have a lot coming in.
Well, if I had my way, Eric, I would keep you here for the next hour or two
Yeah, for sure.
to discuss. One thing I'm super interested in my own life is just like community placemaking and how to
Yeah,
design communities in a proper way, which is its own can of worms. Which, as much as I want to ask and talk to you about it,
yeah.
maybe we'll save that for a future time.
I
'Cause I
think
know,
so. We have a potential couple of projects coming up on that, and if we get them out there into the world, we'll be able to share some of those. I'd love to come back and talk to you about that. But there's a lot of really great people who are working on that, trying to encourage parishes to use the talents, like the parable of the talents, all this property that they have, and be able to build real communities out of it. It's something that I've really been very interested in my work over the last 20 years to concentrate on. But again, yeah, that's a whole another conversation. But
well,
certainly,
these
we're looking at, we did a project in Detroit, and we've done projects with St. John in McLean, and a number of things. But I've had more and more inquiries from serious people wanting to build communities around churches, and I think it could be really, really great.
Well, we have, I think these videos go out. They go out all over the world, but they certainly go out all over the United States. So, if people are interested in your work, Eric, or if they want to reach out to you, where can they contact you at? Where can people find you?
Well, you can go to my website. It's Bootsma Design or .com, or just Bootsma.com. Goes to the same place. You can reach me there. There's a contact form if you want to reach out, if there's any work that you'd like to talk about, or even if you just want to ask advice or talk. Always happy to reach out and talk to people, and any students or anyone who interested in doing more of this work. But there, I'm also Twitter at Erik Bootsma on Twitter, so you can find me on there, or X as it's called now. So always very active there. So
All right. We'll include all of those in the description.
fantastic.
Eric, I appreciate you taking the time to do this, and we will get you back on as soon as we can.
That'd be great. Love to talk.
All right. Thank you now. God bless.
Thanks.